everyone, Courtney here, and today I've been rereading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1807, so let's dive into the preface. Normally I would give more of an introduction than that, however Hegel actually begins his preface by saying that he believes that to introduce his work in that traditional sense in which one might outline, say, their final results or aims or compare their work to other writers that have written on the same subject would be, he says, not only superfluous, in other words, unnecessary, but also misleading. That is to say, he thinks it would be counterproductive to understanding his work, or any philosophical work for that matter. He writes, "It is customary to preface a work with an explanation of the author's aim, why he wrote the book, and the relationship in which he believes it to stand to other earlier or contemporary treatises on the same subject. In the case of a philosophical work, however, such an explanation seems not only superfluous, but in view of the nature of the subject matter, even inappropriate and misleading." And he goes on to provide some reasons to support this claim. The first is that he says, a preface is not a proper way to expound philosophical truth. So that's pretty straightforward. You don't read a preface and then think that you've got this complete understanding of the school of metaphysics and now you can build your moral theory based off that just because you've read some kind of preface out of a philosophy book. And that's of course because it's not fleshed out. It doesn't provide reasons for the conclusions that it gives. So that's pretty straightforward. The next reason he mentions is that he says that because philosophy moves in the element of universality, there's a tendency to read the final results of a work and then think that you've understood the thing, capital T, in its totality. So by that he means that because philosophy deals with more abstract content than other fields of study, like say science, where you're dealing with material objects, it's easier to make an error in thinking that because you have read the final conclusions of a work that you have a complete understanding of that work, thing, capital T. And he says that if we contrast this to anatomy, it'll become obvious how much of an error this really is. So he says that you wouldn't read, and I paraphrase, but you wouldn't read an anatomy book and think that because you've understood every part of the body in its lifeless form, that you've now understood the thing, capital T, in itself. Like, for instance, what it is to be a human being. Because you read an anatomy book, or the experience of being a human being because you read an anatomy book. So that's a concrete example of where you wouldn't read final results and think that you've understood the thing, capital T, in itself. Now that word thing, capital T, it's a very abstract term on purpose because of course I don't think that you can probably give a perfect concrete example since it would be an all-exhaustive understanding of something. So everything that it is not, and all of its moments in time, but just for the purposes of trying to explain what he's saying, I'm just saying, like, you wouldn't read an anatomy book and then think, oh, I know what a human being is. You wouldn't read a philosophy preface and then think, okay, now I understand this whole school of thought as a whole. So the other thing, of course, he mentions is that whatever's said in the preface is going to be said in the book anyway, but the most important reason he gives, and I say that because it's the most insightful in terms of being able to understand the rest of his book, is that he says there's a tendency for the mind to only understand diversity in terms of contradiction. And in particular with philosophy, it's an issue. So he contrasts this where if you were reading, let's say, a scientific book on the life cycle of a plant, he says that it would be understood that you don't necessarily think of a flower completely refuting the bud from which it bloomed, or the bud doesn't completely refute the flower, but they are understood to be reciprocally necessary moments that are necessary for each other. And so although in some sense they refute each other, in another sense there is an organic unity in which they are necessary for one another. And yet, when people read philosophy, there tends to be this idea that it's like this battle between different opposing views, and Hegel doesn't necessarily see philosophy as being that. He does see it as having this progression, and that's why I say that's the most important reason, because it's insightful for what he's going to say in the rest of his work. And you'll see this sort of notion of progression coming up over and over again in I think, just about everything that Hegel analyzes, whether it's history and the idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or it's just having understanding even like an object in its totality, understanding that it's many things and at the same time one thing. And so this kind of progression. But anyway, so those are some reasons he doesn't want to introduce his work in that way. But moving on, there is something that he does want to address in his preface. I think it's in the 5th paragraph. He says, "The true shape in which truth exists can only be in the scientific system of such truth. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title of love of knowledge and become actual knowledge, that is what I have set myself out to do." So he thinks that's worth mentioning, that he's trying to elevate philosophy from being a love of knowledge to being actual knowledge by coming up with a more scientific or rigorous rigorous system by which to arrive at truth. So this concept of truth verification is something that comes up a lot in philosophy, and we're kind of seeing that for Hegel, it's going to exist within a shape or a system by which truth is derived, just like science. So he says that this is necessary both by the nature of knowledge itself, but also that there is an external necessity, being that the time is right to elevate philosophy from being a love of knowledge to being actual knowledge and having more of a scientific system. And so he goes on to sort of support this point. He talks about the fact that the spirit, and when we talk about spirit, you can think of the human consciousness as it comes to understand itself within the world, and this kind of like progression towards understanding itself in the world. And so he thinks that spirit is really longing at this point to find truth. And it's always like so easy for me when I'm just sitting here reading the book, but it's so hard for me to like look at the camera and then find the right quotes to pull out to support what I'm saying. But he says that this idea that truth exists in a scientific system it seems to be opposed to a prevailing view at the time, which is that true knowledge or truth would be knowledge of the absolute, so like thing in itself or divine being or something that goes so far beyond science that it would be something more that you would have a feeling or just an intuition of, but not something that you would have a real system for directly obtaining truth. And so he goes on to talk about how you have a school of thought whereby there's this huge emphasis on gaining answers from the world and the material things, but then there's also the consciousness or people who believe that they are giving themselves to God, and by just denying any information from the senses that you are giving yourself to God by having, let's say, faith. And for Hegel, it's not that these views need to be 100% opposed to one another, is the way that I'm understanding what he's saying, but rather that now it's just, we've gone through all of these and the spirit has not found itself in its totality, and now is the time to elevate it to the next step. And the next step in this progression he likens to being like a newborn baby. So just like a newborn baby being born into the world is where science is now, where philosophy is now in its infancy, and that this is like a foundation for what is to come. So instead of seeing this as like these failures or like trying to go from one extreme to the other, Hegel sees this as progress, that now that we've tried to look at the stars for answers and we've tried to look at the world for answers, we've tried to look inwardly for answers, now it's time for the next step in this progression for Hegel. So that's what it is. He does liken this to the birth of a newborn baby. I wonder if I can find that paragraph because, well, to support what I'm saying, but also because it is beautifully written. He says, okay, so paragraph 11, it is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world it has hitherto inhabited and imagined, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past and in the labor of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. But just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap, and the child is born. So likewise, the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms. the frivolity and boredom which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown. These are the heralds of approaching change. So you see that for him at this point, instead of this amalgamation of failures, it's like a newborn baby being brought into the world. So I'm going to leave it there for now because my baby needs me, and I will get back to you on this preface as soon as I can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.